Welcome to the Thematic Edge. This week, it's Mark and I catching up on some themes that we've been talking about for a while. We're going to look into what's been going on with the Iran war. How do we reconcile the never-ending cycle of peace treaties that never seem to actually eventuate? And then really this far into the crisis, if we want to call it that, what are the mitigation strategies that are starting to develop around the world? How are people dealing with this disruption? And in particular, I think one of the focuses has to be on China and how China is reacting to this. What are their mitigation strategies? How did this fit into the Trump-Xi summit in Beijing, and how we read that? And then finally, if we have time, we might talk a bit about what to expect from Kevin Warsh in his early days as the new Fed chairman. So with that, welcome, Mark.
Good to see you again, Marvin, after your travels. And the world never stops, so good to catch up.
It never does, Mark. It's just crazy. I don't know about you, but my backlog of research is absolutely crazy. There are just so many things that I have like half completed. I think, I may actually be putting out a whole bunch of research in the next couple of weeks because there's just all sorts of like half done pieces, but everything is just changing so rapidly that I feel like I never get a chance to finish them. But I want to start with Iran.
Good.
So I'm not going to give you a full victory yet, and I'm not going to admit defeat because I don't think we're there yet. But I do have to, tip my hat to you and say that at least the chessboard seems to look more like what you were suggesting in terms of what the sort of playbook from certainly from Washington was going to look like than what I had expected. I was very concerned that the Iranians would ultimately step up aggression against other states. There was a little bit of that, but not certainly the
Yeah.
destruction that I was concerned about, and that would be precipitated by the U.S. pushing for a quicker resolution to try and get this done before the midterms. And yet that hasn't seemed to have happened. We've got this process that is dragging out. And I have my own thoughts around why that is, but I want to get your perspective, especially since you seem to have been more right than me. So please tell me what you think is going on here.
Gracious as always, Marvin. Thank you. Actually, I'm reflecting on early March when I wanted to write a piece and I almost called it a special military operation. But then But then I realized, that had already been taken. So I also think the US probably had the same reaction function that they didn't really want to call this a war. They wanted to call it a special military operation, but then now that began to imply something else. So they had
Well,
to,
sorry to interrupt, but I believe Donald Trump has actually used that. Like he
as he,
has made a
okay.
joke about this and called it a special military operation with a little wink.
Yes, well, then I guess even if they had called it a special military operation, what the US did is show the discipline that Russia did not. So it launched all guns blazing in the month of March, as it was, telecast to be. And then, when the initial campaign was finished, they did wind down the offensive operations. And I guess if Russia had done something similar, it probably would have, be winning the war of attrition and would have had, some higher moral ground to stand on. Because, that was the kind of framework that I had for the US in the beginning. And it is because I trust very much that this national security strategy that was put out last year, that this strategy of containment implies this preservation of resources and capital and compressed timelines and projecting power dramatically and altering the leverage of your adversaries, but then, retreating to a posture where you can sit and either fight a war of attrition or at least, conserve lives and treasure. So that was my view from the beginning. I know it looked in first week of April like that wasn't on, and then it broke quite quickly after that as they did pivot to the maritime posture. And once they were in the maritime posture, I became more confident because, as I wrote in a couple of my Substacks there in early April, the maritime posture gives them staying power. The U.S. can successfully sit there for months on end and really tighten the vice on Iran's economy. And also, it had the cover of international law. So, the UN Security Council passed the resolution in March that gave all countries well, they already had the right, but reminded them that they have the right to defend and protect their merchant fleets. And the US invited everyone to come and do exactly that. There was a ceasefire, the type of preconditions that Europeans, for example, said that they required, and yet nobody came. So I think that told me two things. Number one, that you know there's a big problem with European countries in particular, but also elsewhere in Asia, where people are not, managing their responsibilities for freedom of navigation and looking after their own merchant fleets in the various choke points around the world where those risks exist. And the US is not going to be that policeman anymore, so they really need to address that underinvestment area. And then secondly, it also told you that the emergency was probably not as bad as everyone made it sound. I mean, in particular, US, China, and Japan were extremely well prepared for the energy shock. They had built up strategic reserves or domestic production, and they could, draw down on strategic reserves rather than paying that high punitive price in the first couple of months of the conflict. So I think that also gave them staying power, and it also kind of debunked this narrative that we're on the cusp of a 1970s like shock, the worst energy shock in history, etc. And I think that got everyone very wrong-footed and produced that short squeeze that we saw in the equity markets through the month of April. So, that's how I sort of ex post analyze those steps. Going forward, like you, I believe the midterm time frame was a constraint, but just not a massive one. And I think the Trump administration is still, looking to the horizon and hoping they can get a better narrative out in front of the voting population by November. But it's not going to drive all the decisions.
Yeah, so there's I think this definitely gives me an opportunity to get some of the ideas on the board in terms of things that I felt like I needed to have an update around, which is, you know, my sort of thinking about this conflict has evolved. I still think that it started with the Trump administration in part provoked by Israel. And again, this point needs to be made clear. It wasn't Israel dragged the U.S. into a war.
Yeah,
It is Israel had saw an opportunity it was going to take advantage of. The U.S. said our interests are aligned on this. This
yeah.
is a unique opportunity for us to overturn a country that has been at war with us for 47 years.
Hmm.
And so they participated in it. And, it was always the upside is, hey, we might get, a positive regime change that will create a friendly regime, Iran like existed pre 1978.
Yeah,
Um, but our downside is we're going to leave it a smoking wreck, right? And I still feel that broad framework is the
yeah.
way to think about it. That's the stop loss is smoking wreck on one end and, maybe a positive regime change in the background. But I think it's important to recognize, and I think Trump is really underappreciated for this. And you've been one of the best traders I've come across. But I've worked with a lot of different traders over the years, and he really strikes me as he is a trader. He is
Yeah.
constantly updating what his, you know, upside versus downside is and recalibrating throughout. And so a lot of the stuff that looks like I don't have a plan is just he is very reactive. But by the way, it might well be that he didn't have a great plan to begin with. I'm not going to go all the way there. I'm just saying what he does really well, in my view, is recalibrate. And I think you have highlighted it. So from my perspective, one of the things that I saw driving this was that he needed to get this done for the midterms. I
Hmm.
think, like a good trader, he has realized that his chance of getting a win on the board before the midterms is diminishingly small right now. And he's like, forget that. I'm just going to go for the long run win here. And to exactly your point, we've talked about this before. The Trump administration, even if you go back to Trump 1, he always had a natural inclination to have an offshore balancing strategy, which is
Yeah.
a naval power offshore that can sit there and use a maritime strategy to starve a country. And it is a time strategy. And so a lot of people who keep thinking that somehow Iran holds all the cards or whatever, I'm looking at this, I'm like, no, absolutely. The the best strategy now that they seem to have pivoted towards
Hmm.
is a hey, we're just going to wait this out and starve Iran because eventually they're going to run out of money. They're not going to be able to govern. We've already taken out a lot of their infrastructure. We've already taken out a lot of their potential. They have to operate under cover as it is because we could resume an attack at any moment now.
Yeah.
Um, and it really does play to the US's hand. Now, I don't think it plays to Donald Trump's hand
Yeah.
in terms of the midterm strategy or midterms anymore. But I think, as we've talked about before, ultimately what I think drives Donald Trump is getting himself on Mount Rushmore. And
Mhm.
he's not going to screw that up just because he's not going to win the midterms. And he might get lucky and still pull it out. And I do think your point about calling out the eh, I don't know whether I'm hesitant to suggest this was part of the strategy all along, but it
Yeah.
is absolutely, I think, something that they see as a um, uh, a positive side effect of this is literally calling out every U.S. ally and saying, "Hey, you guys have been saying all this time that you want to go through this." Rules-based network and whatever. We've set up all the rules for you. You've got a clear violator of UN law across the board.
Yeah.
We've called a ceasefire. Where are your naval assets? Where are your planes? Where are you doing anything? And what you see is that the only countries who have actually stepped up are places like the UAE, right?
Yeah.
And I think this speaks volumes and really does undermine a lot of the sort of blowback against this America First movement, which is basically to say, hey, we were being taken advantage of. You cannot expect us to bear all the costs of keeping the global commons free if none of you are willing to put up anything. And I think that is a really important thing. I'm going to try to. We've never used charts on here. And for our listeners, this is going to be missing. But I am going to try to put up something here, which I know you've probably
Please.
elsewhere, which is
Oh, yeah. I remember that chart. The
this
global
this
choke points.
yeah, and this is not this point is not original to me. um, uh, but it's one that I sort of recreated. And this is global choke points around the world, maritime choke points, all the little circles around the world. What's really, really interesting to me is all the ones that I have put a box around are ones
Yeah.
that the Trump administration has effectively made a move on just in the last year.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it is shocking how many of them they have actually moved on, whether it was, you know, retaking control of the Panama Canal, supporting Argentina to secure Cape Horn,
Yeah.
the defense strategies with Morocco and with Indonesia to nail down the Straits of Malacca and Strait of Gibraltar.
Yeah.
The Bab al Mandeb on the Red Sea, the military agreements with the Philippines to do the Luzon Strait, working with Japan to do the Miyako and Tsugaru Straits. And
Yeah.
then, of course, the infamous Greenland example, and now most recently, the Strait of Hormuz. If you look around all these things, it is crazy
Yeah.
how much they have done in a year. And I think this is really illustrating that the U.S., whether, whether it is the allies want to come along or not, the U.S. is going to create a strategy of sea denial that even as China's navy becomes larger and more sophisticated than its own, the US is still going to be in a position to say they have a check on everything else, right?
Yeah.
So
Uh,
I definitely see this strategy as evolving. What I think is the real interesting question here is that the US is able to do that because it does seem to one, I mean, we highlighted this in the beginning, and this goes back to our conversation with Doomberg. The U.S. is in a unique position to deal with the Strait of Hormuz problems because most of the stuff you would get out of the Persian Gulf, the U.S. produces itself and is fine. It's the rest of the world's problem to some extent. But I guess what's interesting is how little broader effects there have been. Yes, there have been the predicted effects on jet fuel and some other resources across Asia and Australia and Europe to some extent. But like, how do we explain why this has been as contained and shall we say muted as it has been? What are the sort of mitigation strategies that we're seeing around the world to deal with this?
Well, yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. And I would just quickly start by saying, it wasn't just the US that was reasonably well insulated from the shock, but there was a few other countries. And
Yeah.
I would say all the countries that showed that they were best positioned to cope with this shock were the ones more realistically accepting the changed world order, you know. Those that still cling to the past, they were the ones caught out and most vulnerable. And I would even throw the UAE, the Emiratis, into that camp, Even though the GCC had been, seemingly paralyzed in the beginning, the Saudis had preemptively entered into a security arrangement with the Pakistanis, which didn't really do much. And the Emiratis had preemptively joined the Abraham Accords and various other type of diplomatic maneuvers showing this diversification strategy preemptively, knowing that the tensions were building and a conflict was coming. And I think, as I mentioned, Japan has been building up all of these redundancy strategies, not just high level of reserves, but also they floated this idea before the one that's currently taking shape now, where having the Middle East build their own storage facilities at the destination of the consumers. So, the Saudis and Emiratis have storage facilities in Japan now. So this gets exports out of the choke point and can be kept off the market until prices are right to be sold, etc. And then, of course, we know China was like one of the best prepared, and I think China is the best prepared in almost every category. Critical minerals to production.
Well, let's I'd like to actually segment China specifically. So let's
Okay.
push that off for a second, because you've actually had a lot of really interesting things about China's strategy that I want to probe in greater depth.
Okay.
So uh, let's focus on some of the other places first. And I totally agree with your point about who was prepared for this and who wasn't. You've talked about some of the ones who've been prepared. What about the ones who haven't been prepared?
Well, of course, Europe, like the serial offender, they just keep getting caught out time and again, which, to be fair to Europe, it's not one voice. So,
Yeah,
you have two or three countries within the EU who have been pounding the table on being prepared and accepting the changed reality. But, it's a consensus-driven, policy forum, and it takes time to implement. So, I would say, even though they hadn't conceptually accepted reality, the countries that were more endowed naturally ended up being the ones insulated. So, Norway ended up, being a beneficiary, a kind of windfall in the current environment, and certain other countries which are not very dependent on, petroleum as an energy source. So, Europe as a geographic sphere, worst prepared, most badly hit. But it's both conceptual and dependency driven. So I would put them in that category. The emerging world is always the most vulnerable to shocks. They don't have the financial resources to prepare and build the strategic reserves, etc. And if they don't naturally produce energy in their domestic economies, then they're vulnerable. So I don't fault them for policy error. It is just it's a nature of the circumstances, etc. So yeah, I think from an analytical point of view, it's better to focus on those that were prepared rather than those that were hit, because I think it implies where resource allocation is going to swing to. So there's the preemptive strategy, which I think when we get to talking about China, I think it's worthwhile to really understand why China uses preemptive strategy across every dimension of their economy, versus the reactive strategy. And the reactive strategy has been, I feel, incredibly positive, because it was a different type of shock. The geographic choke point was different than the resource one of critical minerals from China, the giant export market through the tariff shock in the U.S. versus the Ukraine war, and before that COVID. So each one of these shocks that we've experienced in the last 6 years have had a different context to them, and they're teaching that lesson of self-sufficiency and resilience differently.
yeah.
And so I think that, I don't, maybe it's too optimistic, but I feel like this one finally got through. I think everyone got the message finally, and that the reactions that we have seen has been this move towards diversification and self resilience, not necessarily based on one hedging strategy, but across the spectrum of hedging strategies, including, your spheres of alignment and who is trustworthy and who is not trustworthy. Because I think there's a lot of like zero trust hedging that you can do that also secures your self-dependency. So it's been interesting to analyze from that perspective.
So we should turn to China, but I'm intrigued. I want to probe that question. Like, do you really think at this stage, like eventually they're going to have to, but I'm not seeing a lot of signs out of Europe or say Canada or Australia that they have gotten the message, Mark. Am I wrong, or what are you seeing that suggests that even those countries, which I like your preemptive versus reactive, but I'd almost divide the reactive into two. There's the
Yeah,
reactive that is reactive but somehow well prepared for this, like
yeah,
I would say the US is reactive, right? To the point of
yeah,
Trump's, trading strategy, or, you know, the US did not prepare for this. They, in some sense, lucked into having such a fantastic hand dealt to them in terms of resources and geography and
Mhm.
everything else. Um, and to some extent, one could say Canada is sort of in that
Yeah.
situation as well. But my goodness, like the Europeans do not, they had a bad hand dealt to them, and they've made it far worse.
Mhm.
The Australians had a fantastic hand handed to them and have somehow managed to completely bungle it.
Yeah.
like, so what is it that you're seeing that gives you hope that those countries are coming along, those slow reactive or
Mm.
you know I don't even know how you describe their reactivity, um, uh, forced reacted
Right.
countries. What gives you hope that they're actually coming to see that the world order is very different and they need to realign?
Well, I think the differentiation that you just went through, I would argue, is the starting point analysis.
Okay.
So the starting points were very low for many countries that shouldn't have been that low. So when I say I'm encouraged by the reactions I've seen, is because the directional movement for all of them is the same. So if their starting point is very low, then the directional movement is not going to produce any results quickly. But particularly within democracies, that directional movement is suddenly the opposition has a bigger voice. Incumbent politicians get hit very hard by the headline news and the inflation and the revelation of the dependency, etc. So that directional needle on politics is pretty consistent everywhere in the world. You see it hitting UK and it is hitting Australia and it's hitting any country that can point to the incumbent party and say it's your policies that led to this vulnerability we have. So that's one. But in democracies, as we know, it takes time for that needle to swing, to have a minority opposition in the single digits rise to sort of 20% and be a real threat in the next election takes time in the world, Western world democracies. That's number one. And I think number two, like if you're a developed country, a rich country, but resource constrained, then your reaction is different. So like I was analyzing the moves by, South Korea and Taiwan and Japan and Philippines and countries like that completely differently than say, Brazil. Brazil is a very interesting what do you call it? Control group to analyze of
Yeah.
this group because they are not necessarily military aligned and they're geographically neutral and they're resource endowed, etc. And they were able to pivot and trade the last two or three shocks very effectively. So that gives you like I think a control comparison for other countries along the political perspective spectrum. Because for sure, the more autocratic the country, the more hierarchical the decision making, the more decisive their reactions have been to these crises. And you take India, for example. India has also been very, I think, politically agnostic and just went out and made deals wherever necessary to buy energy from different
Yeah.
sources, etc. And I think this favors Trump's mentality. This is how he wants to relate to China as well. Is he wants to say, look, trading oil, trading agriculture, trading these raw commodities. This we can do on a kind of zero trust basis. This is just transactional. Uh,
Yeah.
and uh, and I think that the countries that can view the world and view this level of resource dependency agnostically, they have been more able to respond in an effective way to this crisis. If you're really pinned in by your view on climate change and ESG and human rights and your political campaign platform that you recently ran on, all of these artificial constraints. If you're really pinned in by that, then of course your reaction has been poor.
Yeah. So, we should pivot to China there. I do think that you raise an interesting point about and in fact, let's just explore that for a brief moment before we go to China's broader mitigation strategy, and also how the Trump-Xi meeting played
Yeah.
into Iran and into this broader picture. Um, you and I had an exchange on Substack notes about the
Make
uh,
business, not war. Yeah.
yeah, make business, not war. And you just made a really interesting point there. Like you said, the make business, not war in this case is really about commodities because commodities are something that you can trade relatively trustlessly.
Yeah.
Whereas my pushback to you
Mm.
was I'm not sure that doing more trade with each other actually lessens the risk of war. That's actually not a historical lesson. In fact, the historical lessons would say the opposite, right? And so you still have to be very guarded about trading your highest and best uses things like,
Yeah.
strategic commodities and technology and things like that.
Yeah.
And you know, what I'm hearing you say is that you effectively agree with that. You were talking about make business not war in a different dimension. Am I hearing that correctly, or how are you seeing that?
Yeah, absolutely. That, I gave you the anecdote of, the Cold War era when Russia and the US used to do grain deals all the time and various types of,
Oh, I'll remind you about the Great Grain Robbery, but
okay. There's always a counterpoint. It's true. But I mean, like, very low levels of trust are necessary for a couple of once-off big purchases of grains and minerals and energy and even Boeing aircrafts these days. So I think like the we all I agreed with you that I still hold to the bifurcation view of the world, but
okay,
bifurcation is a spectrum, as we
yeah,
know, and the higher you go up the spectrum to the dual use categories and proprietary technology categories, the bifurcation becomes incredibly concrete
yeah.
and a whole lot of business is excluded. But I think there's sufficient business to be done in this lower half of the spectrum between US and China that they could be getting along a lot better. And while it doesn't boost trust enormously to be doing this kind of trade, it boosts trust a little bit, you know.
Okay.
It is a net positive. How big of a net positive is another story. And I think
So,
that was an important frame of mind for the US entourage to arrive in Beijing because the US had just, severed the supply line of China in Venezuela and Iran, in the previous 3 months, So you have to come and saying, look, I'm not all about, cutting off your global supply lines. I'm also here to say, let's do some business elsewhere. So I think that there was a need to put those military operations in perspective, that this isn't changing, the overall relationship we're seeking with you. We're still seeking a G2. It's just those were some low-hanging fruit that we had to act on, and we did. So, I felt it was a bit like that. It was a much more pragmatic, big boys conversation, and I think she is a big boy and can take it in that context. And so now, the two, transactional leaders can hash it out to see how far up this trustless spectrum they're willing to go. But for sure, and this is a different point, which is, we won't go into deeply today, but I think the showcasing of all the weaponry that we've seen in the last year is enough to make it very, very clear to the US and China and also Russia that we can destroy the hell out of each other very
yeah,
effectively these days. And so it's a little bit like that the mad mutual assured destruction dente that Russia and the US achieved during the Cold War. I think in the modern context, there was a need to show each other, okay, look, we can all destroy each other. We're reminded of that. And so let's just not go there. Let's find where the safe space is just below that threshold. So I think that was the tone which maybe doesn't sound that constructive to some, but was constructive given, a void of understanding, which is what was probably there before, before the trip.
So you think that was the main focus of the trip? And if I might ask you, or like, so two things. One, what were the key sort of deliverables that you think came out of that? Because there was a lot of questions about was there anything actually delivered, and then was there a shift on Taiwan? Did Trump actually get anything with Iran?
Yeah.
And the final one is, not to politicize this, but I don't think you can avoid dealing with it, is the comparison with, Obama's visit to China. And the idea that they didn't even provide a staircase for him to get back on his plane, versus this immense reception with YMCA played by a band and everybody coming out and showing up for him. And oh, by the way, as long as we're comparing the Trump visit with the Obama visit, why don't we compare the Trump visit with the Putin visit a couple days later? Like,
Yeah.
how do you read China's just complete difference and
Yeah.
in these two things? So I set up a lot for you there, but
No, no, it's actually it's easy for me to respond to that because I think that the posture that the U.S. brought to Beijing was twofold. It wasn't transactional on the geopolitical level. So they didn't give up anything. They didn't swap Iran for Taiwan or anything like that. Yeah, the geopolitical posture was we recognize you. It's a G2 world. Let's make business, not war. We can all kill each other. It's that mutually assured destruction type of respect, and not transactions. That's an important distinction. The transactional element was the tier below. I'm arriving with my entourage of, the 20 richest and most successful CEOs the US has to offer, and to let you know that our business model is every bit as successful and superior to yours in many sectors. Because I think there has been this kind of conceptual challenge as a narrative that's put out there that, maybe the Chinese system is better. It's more resilient
yeah.
against geopolitical volatility and this sort of thing. And I think Trump is saying, no, look at these guys behind me. This is my state-owned economy.
Well, well, in a sense, sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah,
but
no, sure.
we've talked about this a lot, about the sort of multi-domain warfare. China has always been doing multi-domain warfare against the U.S. The
Mhm.
U.S., because it defines warfare, the not just the U.S., the West in general, is so specific about what they define warfare as, a declared kinetic event, right?
Yeah,
Hence this special military operation distinction versus an actual war.
yeah,
And yet, the US, and it's not just the Trump administration, you started to see elements of this in the Biden administration. I would argue not very effectively, but you started to see elements of it. The US has really shifted to, oh, we need to do multi domain warfare as
yeah,
well. And to your point, exactly, bringing all of these super successful, super powerful people who literally are conducting statecraft on their own. I mean, when you
yeah.
think about what Elon Musk is doing with, Starlink and SpaceX and things like this, this is literally a nation state in some sense,
It's
and saying,
it's the
hey,
entire industrial policy in one
yeah,
entourage.
we can bring this at you. I understand you have a model that is bringing a lot of adversarial geoeconomics against us.
Yeah.
Guess what we can bring to you? I did think that that was a flex
Yeah,
effect.
that was not only a flex though. I think that China views America that way anyway.
Yeah,
I think the if you ask the Chinese upper echelon, the elite of China's either Communist Party or the private sector, what they would respect most about the US was the power that came with that entourage that he brought. Like these guys are innovators. They are clever. They know how to build businesses and how to extract maximum value out of their business models. The problem in the past is that US government never even played that card.
Yeah.
They didn't understand that that was the card you're always supposed to play when you come from a Western democracy, free market capitalist economy. You show your entourage because to a state-owned economy because that's what impresses them most.
Let me just interject there. I fully agree, but
Yeah.
I think some listeners might say, oh, well, if I go back and look at other summits, of course they brought business leaders along with them. But I think the distinction, at least I would see, and I think this is what you're saying, is that in the past, it has been, hey, we're here to sign a trade deal, and we're bringing them along almost as like a political payback patronage to our donors to
Yeah.
get trade deals with you. Whereas the character of this was very different. It was this, that's why I describe it as a flex. It is,
Yeah. They had
we
a seat at the
have
table.
this power.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't
We
some
can bring
side
this.
meeting where all the trade officials got together. It was the main forum. They had a seat at the table, and because they're saying China, we can partner with you across all these sectors, across all these domains. We can partner with you up to the level that trust allows. But this is what our business model and economy brings, and we recognize what yours brings, and let's find out where the levels of interoperability are. I think that was the move that was so powerful, in
Yeah.
my opinion, because if you look at the stock markets, like the stock markets are the single most important indicator in the world these days. They tell all the story of both the private sector success, but also the initial success of industrial policy and public-private partnership. And the West has finally figured out, after integrating a completely socialist economy for the last 15 years, that the response that they were supposed to show was public-private partnership with backed by industrial policy. That was supposed to be our response to China entering the WTO and then beginning to work its way through the free market system. And it took us a very long time to figure that out. But now the West has figured it out and then presented to China, they're going to respect that. They're totally going to respect it and say, "Oh, you guys got the message." It's not the West adopting China's business model. It's it's getting over the conceptual hesitancy to implement public-private partnership. That was a negative word, 30 years
Yeah.
ago. It's not anymore. It's actually part of the solution.
Yeah. So then how does this relate to China's mitigation strategies and to the Iran war from the US perspective? Did the US walk away with anything from China? And what was China getting out of this in terms of mitigating the impact of the Iran war on their economy?
I'm not sure it was particularly high level on that account, but I think the U.S. showed, like on the day before the meeting was starting, allowing a large carrier of energy to pass through the straits without having to be stopped by the blockade, etc. It was the U.S. just showing respect, saying, "Look, we're not trying to block your ships from coming out of the strait. That's not our intention. So we'll show respect to you. If you want to work with Iran and pay the tolls just to get your ships out, go ahead. We're not going to intervene." And then the reciprocal treatment from China is, "Look, we agree with you. uh, the IRGC and the theocracy that was running Iran was not helpful for us either. It was a pain in the ass. There was a lot of costs of doing business, and if they would become, pro-business and much more like GCC countries, we would be happy as well." That meeting of minds and agreeing on that, and then the token displays of respect in terms of Chinese ships, that was about it, I think, on the Iran level. I don't see it much higher than that. But I do think that the mitigation strategy that China has deployed for the last 5 years since COVID is important for the US to recognize and then to have and then incorporate it into its strategy. And it is this one of hoarding. So they have, we've been all tracking it in financial markets for decades as they build up FX reserves, which, I wrote in a report to say, traditional FX reserve metrics never applied to China because they were not reserving against a current account crisis. They were reserving against the entire, international capital market system, and so they build up their dollar assets and deposits at their banks. They build them up at their sovereign wealth funds, and they protect them through a controlled currency. It was much more comprehensive than just a simple reserve accumulation strategy like someone like Singapore would do, for example. And I think then they've started to do the same with gold, which you and I have both written about in the last couple of years. They bought the LMB. They're trying to convert Hong Kong into a global hub for precious metals tradings, and they're building a massive onshore storage facility of metals. And then they're doing the same in terms of bond market derivatives trading, and they did the same in energy and energy derivatives trading, etc. Because buffers are the way that a state-owned economy can integrate with a free market, open economy. So, and I gave this analogy in one of my Substacks. It's like the same way they designed the M bridge for their CBDC pilot project. This collection of BRICS countries, which were going to theoretically use it, most of them didn't even have hard currencies and no capital, etc. So how would they all integrate? They were going to pre-fund and make a bridge facility so that everything, atomically settles in a zero trust environment. And that's the way.
Atomic settlement means real-time instantaneous gross settlement. So both values exchange in gross value immediately rather than
Pre-funded.
pre-funded rather than some sort of netting through the day, which is a trust-based mechanism.
That's where the trust comes in. So if you look at China through that same lens on everything they do, that's their strategy. If you have a huge strategic reserve and you hoard like whatever 18 months of processed petroleum products and refined petroleum products, you have this pre-funded buffer to settle for every connective point that you have in the economy. And you do the same for metals, and you do the same for currency, and you do the same for gold, and you do the same for various high-end chips for your industries, etc. So this building buffers and building storage facilities is a strategic requirement for a state-owned economy that wants to integrate with a free market one, and that's what they've done. Now, the cost of that, as we have also written about many times, is profitability. And this is why the corporate profit story in China tells the whole story. The excess, not only the excess capacity, but also this friction of carrying massive excess inventories in everything because you're dealing in a trustless environment.
Yeah.
So there is an attrition game that the West can play with China based on profitability and understanding the cost of these excesses everywhere. And so I think that's the reason, for example, front month oil contracts are always under pressure because the minute this crisis is over, the world is in excess inventory position.
Yeah.
And if there's a trade deal on critical minerals, the next day we're in an excess inventory position for critical minerals. So that weird vulnerability of having such a big economy like China running excess inventory on everything is now a feature of the system. And it impacts the way the forward curves and prices are being traded. So,
Explain to me how this relates to, because I mean, it almost seems like from a financial asset perspective, this is really what's behind your Sinodollar thesis, which you
yeah.
wrote about, what, a week or so ago. And there was an interesting parallel article by the Wall Street Journal that was talking about China's movements with Euroclear. Um, uh, and so could you just explain what the Sinodollar thesis is and how um, the role of collateral, financial collateral in
Yeah.
international organizations and how that relates to this stockpiling of commodities? You're effectively stockpiling financial assets, as you said, with the way to think about China's reserves.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually had flagged it a little bit in an earlier Substack as just a passing comment, but then I decided to feature it more in a full paper because, you know, the
Thankfully, because it's really
thank
good. I
yeah,
highly encourage everybody to go out and read it.
thank you for that. And of course, everybody's inspiration in this space is the same as mine. Brad Sester there is data mining the hell out of all the cross-border data for China and constantly publishing this, very good information on the CFR's website with his blog. And, he'd never wanted to call it Sino-dollars because he was looking at the petrodollar analogy and the Eurodollar analogy and saying, oh, it's a bit more like the petrodollar. But there's also another dollar market, the Asian dollar market, and it's been in place for decades. And I'm sure you had to deal with it when you were at Treasury with the policy considerations. And China had clearly the option to just develop the Asian dollar market. Hong Kong was very active in it, and as it absorbed Hong Kong, it would have been a natural extension, you would imagine. The problem is that the Asian dollar market is all not only dollar loans, but financed in dollars, and China didn't want to develop that vulnerability of having external dollar funding. So the Sino-dollars, as I call them, are funded by onshore deposits. And it's this onshore deposits anomaly that always catches Brad's attention because he's, arguing about this being disguised FX reserves and things like that. But a lot of this is funding the expanding dollar balance sheets of their banks. And so it's unlike the Asian dollar market and unlike the euro dollar market, which is also financed by dollar funding. So I wanted to make that distinction, but the way to look at the custody argument, which was followed up by the Wall Street Journal there, is they have been shifting the custody of their treasury assets and their FX reserve assets to Europe, to Euroclear, where they have a minority ownership in the only 7% in the Euroclear structure, which gives them no authority over policy or implementation of sanctions. And as you know, all the treasuries that are held in custody in Brussels and Belgium and Luxembourg are still like on the Fedwire. They're held. They have sub custody accounts in the U.S. So if the U.S. ever did want to take unilateral action and try to freeze the assets, they could still freeze all the treasuries in Euroclear. But never mind that they diversified. So now they have kind of half custody in the US and a half in Europe, and then a growing bit of custody in Hong Kong. So this is the hoarding strategy plus the diversification strategy that allows them to manage their dollar funding exposure both through the BRI loan book that they run across the global south and the expanding dollar loan book of their big four Chinese banks. So since they're not willing to expose themselves to dollar funding, they need to basically lend out of deposits.
Yeah.
And they have onshore deposits, and then they have this offshore custody exposure that they can use as collateral to finance loans. And then they just diversified their custody strategy as a way to mitigate risk a little bit. So that was the thesis, just showing how it's so consistent with China's view of the world. They want to be able to interact with the global capital markets so that they can have access to international capital, but they won't give up an inch of control of their
On
domestic
their
wealth.
terms, effectively.
Exactly.
You know, w- um, we should have Brad come on here sometime because
Such a good call.
Brad and I are old friends. My only concern is that Brad does excellent work. He's quite the forensic analyst there, but his worldview and perspective are so completely different from you and I. I don't
I
know
know.
how we would actually sort that out because he comes to totally different. I think it's fair to say totally different conclusions looking at those data that he unearths than you or I do.
No, it's
So
true.
that will either be one of the best conversations we will ever have if we get Brad on, or it will be one of the worst. I'm not sure which, but
But yeah, we just don't need to devolve it to the geopolitical implications because I think Brad is very much focused on proving lack of compliance or
yes,
lack of
yeah.
consistency with stated policy and stated norms and things like that. On all of those issues, I 100% agree with him.
Yeah, no, he's absolutely right on that. And he is absolutely an essential person to follow. Well, look, we have come to the end of our time here. I think this has been a really fascinating discussion. I need to get back to that huge stack of backlogged research that I need to publish so that all of my readers are happy. Your readers are very happy because you've been quite prolific recently. But thank you for joining me this week, and I look forward to reconvening in 2 weeks when we can discuss what's up next.
I think we're going to have to discuss Kevin Warsh's first
Yeah,
FOMC. That's
I th
the
I think
topic
that's
waiting to be addressed.
probably the best topic. But thank you, Mark. Take care, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.